The African Union and its presidents and heads of state have shown a lot of concern about the ongoing war in Ukraine triggered by a Russian invasion. They have been involved in several interactions aimed at ensuring a peaceful settlement of the situation. Efforts have been made to facilitate a peaceful end to this war, and delegations of African leaders have had meetings with presidents and leading officials from Ukraine and Russia.
And this is precisely what we would like to explore, so that all of us together can contribute to bringing this war to an end.
The African Union chairperson and president of Comoros Island, Azali Assoumani, Zambia's president Hakainde Hichilema, Senegal's president Macky Sall, and South Africa's president Cyril Ramaphosa met with the Ukrainian president Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian president Vladimir Putin. The African Union has criticized the invasion by Russia and called for a de-escalation from the very beginning. But Russia insisted that its decision to send troops to invade Ukraine was necessitated by Ukraine's flirtations with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO and its Western leaders, the United States and Western Europe, which it claims are security threats. The motivations of the African leaders in trying to solve the Ukrainian war aren't entirely altruistic. In failing to handle their agricultural production optimally before now, African countries have ironically cultivated an unhealthy dependence on Russia and Ukraine for their supply of grain, fertilizer, and vegetable oil. And the supply of these products has been extremely affected by the war, which has created a shortage that has predictably led to significant food price inflation in African countries. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has been open about this, saying that, quote, "The human and negative economic impact and tension arising from the conflict between Ukraine and Russia is a grave situation that affects all of us in an interconnected world." Food inflation in African countries, with the exception of the Comoros, has witnessed a steady rise from 2014 to 2023. Nigeria's rose from 9.48% to 24.51%. Senegal from 1.9% to 11.82%. Egypt went from 12.42% to 57.46%, and South Africa rose from 7.55% to 13.34%. African food prices have soared since 2020, reaching an average of 23.9% increase in 2020 to 2022, the highest since the 2008 global financial crisis. Nearly all the countries that participated in the African Peace Mission, established to quell the war between Ukraine and Russia, have experienced accelerated inflation since 2022, when the war broke out, with the prices of chicken, pepper, fish, onions, peas, and other staple products undergoing a steep rise. The main drivers of this price food inflation were initially factors like rising oil prices, droughts, export restrictions, stockpiling, and pandemic-induced supply chain disruptions, which interacted with the many African countries having net import dependence for things like wheat, palm oil, and rice, which were mostly sourced from Russia and Ukraine. Once the war started, things got difficult because Ukraine's production and export capacity were compromised by Russia's attacks. On the other hand, Russia had its trading capabilities hurt by international sanctions that most countries have embraced. Ukraine was responsible for a third of wheat imports to Africa, and the difficulties led to the price of wheat, as well as the price of sunflower oil and some other food imports that are parts of the staple diet in many African countries, rising. The effects of the war also have had some impact on the availability and cost of fuel imports to the African continent, which has many oil-producing countries. Africa has failed to parlay this resource availability into local production of petroleum products. This has made it vulnerable to rising energy prices arising from the conflict situations in faraway Europe and Asia. The war has put millions of Africans in danger of deeper exposure to poverty, instability, and insecurity, especially in the areas around the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. It is important to note that Africa's negative outcomes from the Ukraine situation are exacerbated by its insecurity and lack of local agricultural investment. Now, the local prices of staples like bread, pasta, and other flour-based products are much higher in most of sub-Saharan Africa, leading to unrest. This is why African leaders are so motivated to make these honestly futile attempts to get the warring parties to a place of compromise and agreement. Wheat and sunflower oil accounted for 96% of Africa's agricultural imports from Russia and Ukraine in 2020, with $6.9 billion worth bought by Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Tanzania, Algeria, Kenya, and South Africa. The painful effects of the Ukrainian war should push African countries into producing these items, or at least viable substitutes at competitive prices within the continent, and diversifying their sources of supply from other regions. To address these issues, African countries can reduce their dependence on wheat imports by promoting indigenous crops such as millet, teff, sorghum, and cassava. These crops are resilient, adaptable, and more nutritious, contributing to food security and economic development. Investing in research and development, improving agricultural infrastructure, providing credit to farmers, and implementing favorable policies are necessary steps to supporting the production and consumption of these indigenous crops. Diversifying food production and developing regional food security strategies can enhance Africa's resilience to shocks. Cooperation among African countries in resource sharing, coordinated production and marketing, as well as trade negotiations can strengthen the continent's ability to withstand future challenges. In terms of energy security, Africa should refine its own petroleum products to reduce import dependence. Currently, the continent produces about 8 million barrels per day of crude oil, but only refines about 1.5 million barrels per day. This means that Africa exports most of its crude oil and then re-imports it as refined products at higher cost to its economic detriment. Increasing refining capacity and phasing out fuel subsidies, which primarily benefit the wealthy, can enhance energy security and create job opportunities. By increasing domestic production, refining oil, and embracing alternative energy sources, Africa can lessen its vulnerability to external shocks. Ultimately, the war in Ukraine has had severe consequences for Africa, particularly in terms of food security and energy prices, but it also provides an opportunity for lessons and setting a new agenda for Africa's economic independence and stability.